I'm not actually going to say anything specific about the publicist thing. I'm happy to answer questions about that later if anyone's remotely interested. But there is some connective tissue between the last presentation and this, in that I want to talk a bit about data, which as a creative is something that I've never thought is particularly sexy. Somebody who's been through the education system in this country, I've been taught to think that data is horrible because the English teachers like me, so they told me that I should hate the maths teachers. And so I never really learned anything about maths, but I've recently discovered that data is quite important. And so because Peter wanted me to do a presentation with funny pictures in it, I found this one. And I'm going to try and make an argument for why culture, data, storytelling and business have always been part of the same thing. And that in a weird sort of way, in the marketing industry and in advertising agencies, we've sort of forgotten that. So, a long time ago, we all lived in the country and had weird teeth. And far from that being a kind of idyllic life, we were slaves, we were vassals. And when data first sort of entered history really in the UK, it was with the Doomsday Book, which was a means of control, and it was the way in which William the Conqueror kind of totted up his assets, many of which were human. But that sort of dark side of data, I think, is it's something that we still carry with us, but something that perhaps we ought to forget. I learned recently that Henry II, who probably wasn't a great kind of egalitarian, he provided licenses for the first markets in Great Britain in sort of 1150 or something. I know I'm a bit shaky on the dates. And as a result of that, you started to get the formation of towns. And so if you had a priory with a sort of tenuous sort of toe bone of John the Baptist or whatever, you would set up a market licensed by Henry, and people from the surrounding countryside would come in and sell stuff. And then eventually you'd have enough money that you'd build a cathedral, so it had a very tall spire, which you might think was because they wanted to reach God, but actually it was because they wanted people travelling on nearby roads to know that there was a market there. So the church was there to announce, come and buy and sell stuff. And people started to collect together and started to share information, data if you like, and ideas. And so as a result of Henry II, and it might be a tenuous link, the first tech clusters actually started to happen. So the idea of money and data and people and the transference of ideas and the sharing of ideas is nothing new. It wasn't invented in the valley. And look at London and look at the street names. We've got Bread Street, Brick Lane, where I work, nothing to do with the bricks on the street. Everyone got upset recently when they lifted them up and replaced them with asphalt because they used to make bricks there. Leather Lane, which was a great place to get your outfit before you went to Love Lane, to indulge in what was on offer there. And I discovered recently that Greek Street used to be called Grope Cunt Lane, which is interesting. The etymology of that slightly dodgy word is actually the same as the word quaint, which means beautiful place. So anyway, that's a different lecture on feminism and language. But anyway, we'll move on. So you have this kind of this thing where the people start to collect together in towns. They were no longer vassals. They had their own rights. They weren't owned by a lord. So they had freedom, they had license, they could share things, including diseases probably. But that's where creativity came from. And from license you had licentiousness, you had all sorts of kind of crazy stuff bubbling up in society. And these people that were sharing data and ideas and becoming incredibly creative and buying and selling things started to organise themselves in guilds. And the guilds built buildings that looked a bit like churches, and everybody was very important, and business flourished. And as a result of that, culture started to have a means of financing. And this is something that I also think is kind of interesting. We tend to think that culture ought to be paid for by the government and shouldn't be funded by commercial interests. But it was the guilds that first put the money up to get morality plays and mummers plays happening, which was the origins of the theatre. And so these are some medieval pictures at the top, and that's the sort of bloke that drinks beer and has weird facial hair and does mummers plays out in the West Country probably. And so this culture still exists, but it comes from this relationship between data and sharing and marketplaces and people collecting together. That's the origins of entertainment and culture. So without that, you wouldn't have got Shakespeare, because he really was he was the sort of follow-on and the increasing sophistication that kind of happened after this big bubbling up of sort of theatrical interest in the Middle Ages. And then you get to Skyfall. It's a tenuous link, I know. And lots of other things happen too. But it's funny how squeamish we are about the sort of product placement in Skyfall and about commercial interests funding culture. But it's always been like that. And you read Shakespeare and you know exactly who was paying for it and who his audience was and who he wanted to please and who he was afraid of. So invention, creation, and also the bastard child of invention and creation, which is innovation. We often think that innovation is like new stuff, but actually it's turning invention into money. So invention is actually turning money into ideas, and innovation is turning those ideas into money, I think. And so this all that kind of stuff comes from data and stories. It comes from the sharing of information, and it comes from this rich interplay between people who are gifted with narrative and people who are gifted with money and finance and points of data. Alan Turing is a really sort of fantastic person to think about at this point. He was the first person who actually figured out how we can actually get machines to think. And the Turing machine, as you probably know, is the origins of the computer. So Turing was able to take data points and turn it into action. Without Turing, we couldn't have the idea that the phone that's in your pocket, it's also a camera, and it's also a music player. It's lots of other things. It was Turing that figured out that you could actually command an object to be something else. All you needed was the command to tell it what to do. So there's nothing new in the iPhone, actually. And Claude Shannon is another one that, if you haven't heard of him, you should check him out. Very interesting guy. He worked at Bell Labs in the 50s, and Bell Labs were exactly like Google today. And they paid lots of interesting, clever mathematicians to play around with data and come up with mad ideas. And they did weird shit with exploding mice and stuff like that didn't really make any sense because they were odd. But he actually then cracked the code for information. So it was Shannon that actually managed to turn binary into words. He figured out that actually all a word really is a picture of a sound, and he was able also then to sort of create computer language and computer code that could start to give us the modern sort of history of information technology that we have now. So storytelling, data, mathematics, creativity, people gathering together in clusters and in groups has always been part of the history of human progress. And this is what leads us to the sort of great devices that we enjoy today. I think what's sad, in my experience, I don't know, I mean, what you will feel, but my experience of marketing communications and my experience of school, my experience of the arguments I have in agencies, is that we don't get that these things are intertwined, and that the successes that we've had as a culture come from the interlinking and interplay of those things. We tend to be very divisive in our cultures. We're not good at blending left brain and right brain. And actually, it turns out that this left brain, right brain thing is kind of bollocks anyway, we've discovered recently. But we think of the right brain functions as being the very creative, and the left brain being this sort of analytical and cold, and yet all your language skills are on the left side. So perhaps an art director and copywriter team is supposed to be left brain, right brain. I don't know, but they self-identify with the softer cultural literary space, and that's what I self-identify with. And we tend to think of the analytics people and the numbers people as being the sort of dark side of agency life. And you have some clients who prefer the big emotional statement and are slightly terrified of the technology or of data, and they think the technology is all about, must be very below the line and sales driven. It can't be about building brands. And we have this very divisive view of where the sort of data point of view and where the storytelling point of view come from. So we've got these divided cultures. So you've got this scientific thing. You've got selling versus branding, science versus art, rational versus emotion, data driven versus story driven. Everything is this sort of false dichotomy, I think, in our cultures, below the line versus above the line. And so I think that what we need to find a way of doing in our organisations is figuring out how we can blend those different cultures. Organisationally, it's very hard. Traditionally, in advertising agencies, it's a very monomaniac organisation, and if you use a computer, you're a Mac monkey. And so that we have to find better ways of bringing talent in, because by the way, they're all off working at Facebook and Google and learning how to be engineers and making fantastic amounts of money. So we've got to find ways of making people who don't see the world in this sort of divided way feel comfortable in our organisations. And so data is a big issue right now. We're all talking about big data. You hear this phrase big data all the time, and these are some slightly terrifying statistics. So by 2020, there'll be 50 billion devices connected on the planet. I mean, that's an insane number of objects, obviously much, much more than the total population. And in 2010, people generated 200 billion gigabytes of data. So that's a MacBook Air for every single person on the planet. So we're drowning in this stuff. Most of us who work in agencies and people on client side as well, you've got lots of data, some of which you don't want to share with agencies, some of which you do, and everyone's a bit terrified, but no one really knows what to fucking do with it, and no one can analyse it, and it's all just sitting there building up. This is a terrifying thing. 90% of the world's data is less than 2 years old. It tells you that probably most of it's a bit shit, because it's all about sort of weird data points about what people are doing with their phones. But nonetheless, there's lots that we can do with this stuff. There's a really good article in this week's Economist that is worth looking at, talking about cities as open-air computers. Everyone's going around with these devices in their pockets that are location-specific. If you use Halo, and if you don't, it's brilliant, right? Get black cabs via an app on your phone, fantastic. Halo knows where you go, what you're interested in. It kind of knows that your journey through the city. The city is becoming, the information that they must have from the Oyster card, the points about the Olympics and what we've learned there. We're starting to get to a point where via the devices we have in our pockets, without the need for some big governmental mainframe that knows our inner thoughts and wants to put radios in our teeth, data doesn't have to be paranoid. There are opportunities to tap into third-party services that people are using, and within those kinds of relationships to find new services that are incredibly exciting. So there's a role for brands, sorry about the pixelated picture there, there's a role for brands to be a good Samaritan in this terrifying world where we're drowning in data. And so there's an incredible role, I think, for brands and smart agencies to help deal with this mountain of data and start turning it into services that can really develop brand value and develop product opportunity for clients. And so, I mentioned Halo just now. We're doing stuff with Spotify and Facebook and Coca-Cola at the moment, which are interesting tie-ups. Lots of people are looking at this as huge value to be had in cracking data and turning it into stories. So to kind of conclude this point, we're all a bit terrified about the future of our industry at the moment. I think data is perhaps the answer. If we can crack it, we can find people that can turn that data into stories, then as Arthur O'Shaughnessy says, each age is a dream that is dying or one that is coming to birth. If we crack the data and storytelling part of it, then it's definitely one that's coming to birth. Thank you very much.